I built my dad's company to $500 million. He thought I'd just walk away. Now he pays me to survive. When people say family businesses are complicated, they usually mean things like who gets the corner office or which cousin is stealing paper clips. But in my case, it meant watching the man who used to braid my hair before school walk onto a stage, take credit for my work, and then fire me before I could say a word. My name is Catherine Zeta-Jones. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 10 years, I was the strategic engine behind Zeta Foods, a heritage brand in the heart of California that went from sleepy to seismic in 5 years. We made soup bases, broths, dry mixes, nothing glamorous, but in the right hands. Even something as ordinary as dehydrated onion powder can become a multi-million-dollar operation. And I had the hands, or at least I thought I did. My father, Richard Zeta, founded the company in 1978 after inheriting a spice blend recipe from his grandmother. He grew it through sweat, charm, and absolute control. For years, he ran everything from purchasing to packaging, and when I was a kid, I thought it was magic. I'd sit in his office, coloring, while he barked orders into a rotary phone and scribbled numbers on yellow pads. He'd point to the warehouse through his office window and say, "Someday, this will all be yours." But as I got older, I realized the word yours didn't mean what I thought. What he meant was, someday I'd help run it, not lead it. That position, it turned out, was reserved for my brother Stephen, who once got promoted after mixing up paprika with cayenne on a packaging run. I took the long road, business school in New York, internship in a multinational, 5 years in supply chain optimization across 3 continents. And when I came home at age 28, I came not as his daughter, but as the woman who had turned a regional brand in Singapore from bankruptcy to IPO in under 2 years. Still, in his eyes, I was the same little girl holding a clipboard for fun. So I didn't fight him. I asked to start in operations, then moved through product dev, vendor relations, and finally landed where I knew I belonged, leading strategy. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't ask for titles. I didn't post press releases. I just fixed things. When costs ballooned, I renegotiated sourcing in Vietnam and saved us $300,000 a quarter. When customer interest dipped, I partnered with local chefs to create a seasonal artisan line that doubled our visibility. I secured shelf space in 11 new states and quietly introduced plant-based alternatives before the trend curve peaked. Every time the board toasted a win, they looked to my father or to Stephen, who'd give a confident smile and repeat something I'd explained to him 2 days earlier. And every time, I bit my tongue. I told myself it didn't matter who got credit, that the success of the business, the security of the employees, and the legacy we were preserving were more important than headlines. But that thinking only lasts until the floor gets pulled from under you. The deal that changed everything came from a distributor called Core Harvest, a rising giant in the wellness grocery sector. They were looking for a manufacturing partner with legacy credibility, but modern distribution. In other words, us. I spent 9 months building that contract. It took 2 trips to New Jersey, 4 Zoom breakdowns, and a complete pivot of our top-selling product. It was, without a doubt, the most valuable business deal in the company's 40-year history, and I handed it in with a ribbon. I remember the exact moment I dropped the final signed contract on my father's desk. He glanced at it, smiled faintly, and said, "Stephen's going to love this." The next morning, the company held a town hall. Everyone was gathered in the shipping bay, where Dad always delivered the big news. He stood up, holding the contract in his hand, and said, "Today, we celebrate a turning point in our company's journey, and we have Stephen to thank for leading the charge." I felt Lana, my assistant, shift beside me, her nails dug into her notepad. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. But inside, something snapped. Later that afternoon, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside, a letter from HR. My position was being eliminated due to a strategic restructure. No meeting, no conversation, just a white envelope and a deadline to clear out my office by Friday. I walked into my father's office. I didn't sit. I held the letter in both hands and asked one question. Why? He leaned back in his chair like this was a routine personnel matter. The board thinks you're too involved in execution. You're too close to the ground. We need to elevate the brand. Elevate it with who I asked, Stephen. He has the right instincts, he said, and he listens. You question everything. It wasn't an answer, but it was all I was going to get. That night, I drove home in silence. I didn't call my mother. I didn't cry. I didn't even drink. I opened a file on my laptop called Project Evergreen, a name I had typed into the search bar on a sleepless night 2 years ago. It was my plan B, not because I ever thought I'd need it, but because I'd always known that one day. Someone in that building would push me out. It included names, suppliers, price models, contacts from my Asia days, and one especially important document, a side letter from a processing plant owner in Modesto. Howard Lynn, he once told me, if you ever need a partner, not a boss, call me. I stared at the screen for an hour. I didn't feel pain. I felt calculation. They thought I'd disappear, that I'd go start a blog or become someone's CMO, that I'd let the next press release bury my name completely. They forgot I built the systems. I negotiated the contracts. I secured the supply chain. And they forgot I still had access to everything that kept them alive. The day after I packed the last of my things from Zeta Foods, I didn't sleep in or binge watch some show to numb the sting. I drove straight to Modesto, a quiet stretch of warehouses and farmland, 2 hours from the office where I had just been erased. Howard Lynn opened the door to his office with that same steady expression I remembered from our vendor calls, quiet, composed, already 3 steps ahead. He didn't ask what happened. He just poured me tea like always, sat down across from me, and said, "So, we doing this." That was all. No sympathy, no small talk, just business. And somehow, it was exactly what I needed. I nodded. "I want to activate Evergreen." I said, "Fully?" He leaned back, nodded once, then opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thin black folder. "Then we start today." I wasn't walking in as someone looking for revenge. I was walking in as someone who had already seen the worst and realized she had survived. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Evergreen had started as a contingency plan, something I had quietly built when I realized Zeta Foods was never going to see me as more than an operator. It was a concept built on everything the company refused to become: agile, ingredient forward, private label capable, and fast to pivot. Howard had always been the most efficient partner I'd worked with. And 3 years ago, I invested in his facility's automation upgrade under a private agreement. Now, I was converting that into a majority stake in a new entity, Everlyn, within 48 hours. We had registered the new brand, set up a digital filing system, and brought in 2 key consultants I'd worked with on previous formulation projects. They didn't ask questions. My reputation in the industry spoke for itself. They knew that if I was building something from scratch, it was going to matter. We weren't trying to compete with the Zeta Foods brand directly. Not yet. But we were going after everything they had dismissed as low volume or not strategic. Regional grocers who wanted clean label seasonings, meal kit companies in need of proprietary spice packs, independent restaurants looking for supply chain stability without dealing with mega suppliers. I had names, numbers, historic PO data, and more importantly, long-standing trust. Within 3 weeks, we were sampling 5 core blends, 3 from my archived work, and 2 new ones developed from scratch. The test runs were promising. The margins were better than anything Zeta Foods had touched in years, and we were moving faster than any mid-tier brand could dream of. Meanwhile, Zeta Foods was trying to act as if nothing had happened. Stephen had officially taken over product strategy, and the first move he made was to cut 2 SKUs he didn't understand. One of those SKUs accounted for 18% of our Q4 spike revenue. I had built the data model myself. Lana called me from a locked conference room during her lunch break. "They're streamlining everything," she whispered, "cutting R&D hours, killing the health forward line." I asked her how the team was reacting. "They're confused," she said, "but no one's pushing back. They're afraid to get what you got." I didn't tell her that I had already taken meetings with 3 of our old clients under my own name. They hadn't even blinked. One buyer told me, "Catherine, I don't care what the logo says, if you're behind it. I trust the quality." We signed our first pilot deal that same day. A regional grocer in Oregon placed an order for 12,000 units under their own private label. The timeline was aggressive, but Howard made it happen. Everlyn fulfilled it in 18 days. The buyer called me personally to say, "I've never had a vendor move like that. This is how modern food brands should operate." Word spread faster than I expected, quietly, strategically, no press, no ego, just results. And then the first sign of trouble hit Zeta Foods. A national retailer delayed their reorder. They claimed issues with consistency in the reformulated blends. The version I had created had been retired. The substitute didn't pass testing. Their QA flagged it. Stephen didn't respond to the alert for 2 days. I watched the ripple unfold through Lana's updates. A second client pulled out. An entire production batch had to be scrapped. Procurement was scrambling to backfill inventory from new suppliers they didn't have vetted. Howard watched the data roll in and looked at me one night while we reviewed Everlyn's next client target. "They're unraveling," he said, "and they don't even see it." But I didn't cheer. There was no victory in watching your family undo itself, just clarity, the kind that comes from finally seeing the cost of pretending you didn't matter. I wasn't angry anymore. I was moving forward. By month 4, Everlyn had 6 signed clients and 2 more in final contract negotiation. I had kept my name off the website. There were no interviews, no public announcements. I let the product speak, but the calls started to come anyway. One was from a former investor who had tried for years to get equity in Zeta Foods. "I heard you're working on something new," he said. "If it's anything like what you built before, I want in." I didn't confirm or deny. I thanked him for the interest and promised to stay in touch. Then I called Michael Devlin, a finance strategist I'd worked with during the Zeta Foods expansion phase. He had once told me, half joking, "If you ever run your own shop, I want to be your CFO." I told him. It's time. That night, I stood in the middle of the Everlyn warehouse alone, watching pallets being wrapped and sealed for shipment. The place smelled like garlic and cumin and the start of something real. I thought about how I used to dream of my father standing in front of a crowd and saying, "My daughter built this." But now, I didn't need that. What I wanted wasn't applause. It was autonomy. And I had it. They just hadn't realized what they'd given up. It was strange how silence could echo louder than applause after months of being dismissed, cut off, and pushed aside. I found myself in a position where every decision I made created a ripple my old company couldn't ignore. But I didn't gloat. I didn't retaliate. I built. While Stephen scrambled to undo the damage of failed supplier swaps and inconsistent formulations. Everlyn was quietly becoming the go-to partner for a rising class of mid-sized food brands, tired of being overlooked by the big players. My father may have held the title of CEO, but I was now controlling what his company needed to survive. And I was doing it without raising my voice or sending a single press release. One Friday morning, Michael Devlin placed a stack of reports on my desk. Zeta Foods just posted their third client loss this quarter, he said, his tone calm but precise. 2 pulled contracts, 1 suspended for review, all within categories you used to manage directly. I didn't react. The numbers didn't shock me. I had predicted this curve when I ran the operational risk models 2 years earlier, back when no one at the leadership table wanted to hear the word modernize. Michael continued, their margins are tightening. If they lose one more anchor buyer, they'll miss covenant thresholds on their credit line. I leaned back, letting that sink in. I hadn't set out to weaken them. I had only built what I needed to survive after they chose to erase me. But the truth was, their collapse wasn't sabotage. It was the natural result of arrogance, of assuming that someone as integral as me was replaceable. Everlyn wasn't just functioning, it was growing. We were signing repeat contracts now, getting inbound requests from CPG brands that had once waited 6 months just to be ignored by Zeta Foods' procurement team. We had become what they never allowed me to create under their roof. Fast, adaptable, efficient. One of our newest clients, a plant-based sauce brand, asked to meet the founder. When I walked into the room, the owner, a woman in her late 40s, stood and simply said, I heard what happened to you. I've been there. That's why I trust your product more than their story. I didn't need to reply. The room already understood. What came next wasn't a surprise, but it was still surreal. Howard called me one evening after a conference call and said, Zeta Foods just requested a second meeting. This time, directly with you. They're not saying it, but I think they're ready to talk terms. I paused. Did they know it was me all along? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They knew. The message had never been about secrecy. It was about control. I told him I'd take the meeting, not to reclaim anything, but to clarify everything. We scheduled it for a Tuesday at 10. The location was a neutral co-working space downtown, not far from where I had first interviewed for Zeta Foods back in my 20s. That morning, I dressed simply. No power suit, no performance, just presence. I arrived 5 minutes early. My father was already sitting at the far end of the conference table, alone. No Stephen, no legal team, just him and a worn leather notebook he had used since the Reagan era. He looked older, not just in years, but in energy, like the fight that once fueled him had turned inward and started to cost more than it returned. He stood as I walked in, nodded, didn't smile. Thanks for coming. He said. I sat. This isn't personal, he began. And I almost laughed. That sentence always means the opposite. But I stayed silent. We're at a point where we're looking to stabilize key inputs. Everlyn has shown strong capabilities in supply. Your product line matches ours in several areas. We'd like to discuss a supply agreement. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Under what terms? He glanced at his notes. Preferably our historical pricing, or within 5%. I nodded slowly. That pricing model was based on scale you no longer have. Also, your ordering patterns have become inconsistent. Your QA team flagged 2 batches in Q2. That adds cost. He swallowed. Didn't argue. I continued. Everlyn has a current backlog of 4 weeks. I'd have to reroute production to prioritize Zeta Foods. That comes with a premium, 15% markup, net 30 terms, and minimum quarterly volume locked for 12 months. His eyebrows lifted slightly, But he didn't protest. "This is business. Catherine," he said, almost softly. "I know." And it was. This wasn't about revenge. This was about the value of being underestimated and the strength of building something that no one could take away again. By the time the meeting ended, we had a tentative agreement in place. He didn't offer an apology. I didn't ask for one. But as we stood to leave, he hesitated. "You did what I never could," he said quietly. "You adapted. You saw what was next." I looked at him. I learned from the best, and then I learned what not to become. That night, I drove home without music. The silence felt earned. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was simply moving forward. The real power wasn't in being back at the table. It was knowing I could walk away from it. Signing that supply agreement with Zeta Foods wasn't about winning. It was about watching someone finally understand the value of what they tried to discard. The agreement came through quietly, without announcement, without the usual company-wide celebration my father used to host after major deals. And for good reason. He hadn't won anything. He had been cornered by his own refusal to change. And the lifeline now came from the very person he had once told, word for word. "You're too emotional for executive leadership," what he called emotion. I had always known was instinct. That same instinct told me not to trust temporary peace. So while Everlyn continued to scale, I stayed cautious. I assigned 2 project managers to handle the Zeta Foods account exclusively and kept myself 1 layer removed from daily contact, not out of pettiness, but to protect what I had built. I didn't want the noise. I wanted clarity, and clarity came fast. 3 weeks into the agreement, Lana called me on her break again. Her voice was low, clipped, like she had waited too long to say what was building. "Stephen's furious." She said, "He found out about the pricing terms, your 15% increase. He called it extortion." I didn't laugh. I had no reason to. "And your father?" I asked. "Quiet," she replied, which scares everyone more than if he were yelling. I thanked her, ended the call, and stared at the window of my office, where a new shipment of our proprietary pepper blend was being loaded onto a freight truck. I remembered sitting in a similar office at Zeta Foods 5 years ago, presenting that same blend to the executive team, only to be told it was too bold for Middle America. Now, it was our top seller. Funny how being dismissed had aged so poorly. But while the deal with Zeta Foods stabilized our Q3 growth curve, the real breakthrough was happening somewhere else. One of our clients, a fast-rising frozen food startup based in Austin, had just closed a Series B round and was looking to scale nationally. Their COO called me directly. "We're bringing everything in-house except seasoning, and we want to make Everlyn our sole formulation partner." That meant exclusive rights. It also meant volume. A lot of it. We negotiated for 3 weeks, ran pilot tests, stress-tested our packaging line, and finally inked a 5-year deal that effectively doubled Everlyn's valuation overnight. Michael came into my office holding the signed contract like it was a relic. "You just became too important to ignore," he said. I already knew. But what I also knew was that this put us on a new playing field, one that required more than quiet growth. We needed presence, positioning, protection, and strategy. The next board meeting at Zeta Foods didn't go well for them, according to a contact who remained anonymous. Stephen pushed to end the Everlyn contract, citing rising costs and dependency on a competitor. My father, for once, pushed back. "We depend on Everlyn because they do what we can't. If you want out, fix what's broken first." It was the first time since my exit that he had publicly acknowledged my value in front of a formal group. Lana said it landed like a thunderclap. Half the board fell silent. Stephen left the room before the meeting ended, and just like that, the power dynamics began to shift. But this wasn't the climax, not yet. The real breaking point came when Zeta Foods failed to deliver on a seasonal campaign with one of their last standing premium partners. The client had ordered a specialty spice blend for a limited time product, but internal delays pushed the production window too close to their shelf launch. When they tried to outsource a backup formula, the flavor didn't pass review. They reached out to Everlyn, not through Zeta Foods, but directly. The order came with a short deadline and clear terms: if we could fulfill within 17 days, the campaign could proceed. If not, the entire launch would be scrapped and Zeta Foods would be penalized contractually. I read the request 3 times, then called my team in. We reviewed capacity, supply access, logistics, and production impact within an hour. We gave them a yes. We delivered it in 14. The next day, my father showed up at our facility without notice. He stood in the middle of the Everlyn warehouse while machines hummed around him and employees walked past him without recognition. He wasn't used to that. He was used to being known. He waited outside my office until I finished a call. When I stepped out, I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, waiting. "You built something," he said finally. His voice different this time, something real, and I almost didn't see it until it was too late. I didn't offer him comfort, not because I resented him, but because I had moved beyond needing approval. "You still have a company," I said, "but you need to decide what part of it is worth protecting." He looked around once more before saying, "Maybe it's time someone else ran it." Then he left. That evening, I sat in my car longer than usual before driving home, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was grounding myself. That moment, the one where the person who once erased you has to acknowledge you just to survive that moment, doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with silence, with weight, with a strange calm. I wasn't interested in reclaiming a throne. I had built my own table, and now, even the people who had once shut the door were knocking. The morning after my father visited the Everlyn warehouse, an email arrived in my inbox from a name I hadn't seen in years. Noel Ferris, one of the original board members at Zeta Foods, and someone who, years ago, had voted in favor of removing my product line pitch from the 20-20 roadmap back then. He said the market wasn't ready for a woman-led expansion strategy. Now his message read simply, "If you're open to a discussion about next steps for Zeta Foods leadership, I'd like to speak off the record." I forwarded it to Michael, who called me within 5 minutes. He wouldn't send that unless things were falling apart internally. He said, "I think they're circling the drain," but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Everlyn was running strong. Our Q4 projections were up. We had just signed 2 new food service partners in the Southeast. The last thing I wanted was to get pulled back into a system that once tried to erase me. Still, I owed it to myself to listen, not out of nostalgia or revenge, out of strategy. That Thursday, I met Noel in a small cafe tucked into the corner of downtown Santa Clara. No press, no lawyers, just a weathered man in his 60s with a binder full of chaos. He opened it without introduction and slid it toward me. Inside were internal memos, board summaries, client loss statements, and the kicker, a flagged notice from their primary lender warning that another quarterly miss would trigger formal restructuring oversight. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just asked, "Why are you showing this to me?" Noel folded his hands, looked me in the eye, and said, "Because we know who built the company that's still keeping them afloat, and if something doesn't change in the next 60 days. It won't matter who's sitting in what seat. There won't be a company left to lead. The implication was clear. They needed me, not as a consultant, not as a vendor, as the person who could stabilize what had unraveled. I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for months. What does my father say? Noel didn't hesitate. He's not fighting it anymore. The board is. That surprised me. I had expected resistance, sabotage even, but I suppose even pride has an expiration date. Over the next 2 weeks, conversations deepened. I was brought into private sessions with key stakeholders, walked through the revised books, and asked what it would take for me to step into a new role. I gave them 3 conditions. First, full operational authority, no shadow oversight, no back-channel decision-making. Second, board restructuring with at least 2 new independent directors, including one from a female-founded brand. And third, a formal integration plan with Everlyn that preserved its independence while creating shared infrastructure where it made sense. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect and sustainability. I didn't want a title. I wanted leverage when the board vote came. It passed 7-2. 1 abstained the next day. Zeta Foods issued a quiet press release announcing a new strategic operating structure led by an external partner with prior leadership expertise. They didn't name me directly, but the industry knew. The transition wasn't flashy. There was no ribbon cutting, no ceremony, just results. I took a seat not behind my father's old desk, but in a glass-walled corner of the operations wing, where teams actually worked, not just watched. I reactivated product lines that had been frozen for no reason other than ego. I rebuilt the forecasting model based on market shifts, not boardroom theories. And I personally called our top 10 clients to listen, not pitch. What I heard was both validating and sobering. We missed your touch, one buyer said, but we weren't sure if it was allowed to say that out loud. Another said, it always felt like you were the future of that brand. Then suddenly, you were just gone. No one had forgotten. They had just gone quiet. But now, they were watching. My father stayed on as chairman, mostly ceremonial. His presence in meetings was minimal. Occasionally, he'd offer a line of insight, something about supply lead times or old vendor relationships. But for the most part, he watched, not with malice, not with regret exactly, just distance. One evening, after a long day of onboarding a new logistics director, I passed by his office. He was sitting alone, staring at a photo of the factory in the 1980s. He saw me in the reflection and said, without turning around, I thought holding on to what worked would keep us safe. I didn't realize that it was you who kept us moving. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Some truths don't need to be acknowledged out loud to be felt. The team at Everlyn kept operating at full pace. We didn't fold the companies into one. That was never the goal. Instead, we created a dual-system ecosystem where innovation was tested through Everlyn and scaled through Zeta Foods. It gave us range. It gave us balance. And more importantly, it gave the market proof that evolution could come from within. Zeta Foods began recovering, slowly at first, then steadily. Client confidence returned. Product lines stabilized. A national food service brand signed a multi-year agreement for the first time in years. The company wasn't just reacting, it was leading. Looking back, the lesson wasn't about winning or proving someone wrong. It wasn't even about the comeback. It was about ownership, not just of a company, but of my identity, my decisions, and my direction. They tried to erase me from a system I had helped build, but instead of disappearing, I rewrote the blueprint quietly, completely, and on my terms, 6 months into the integration. The company felt different, not just in the numbers, though those were improving steadily, but in the atmosphere. The halls of Zeta Foods were quieter, but not in a nervous way. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when people finally breathe without waiting for something to explode. Teams that had once worked in silos were beginning to collaborate. The R&D lab, which had been shut down under Stephen's cost-cutting spree, was now back in use with a new team lead who had previously left in frustration. She told me during our first strategy meeting, "It feels like we've come out of a coma, like the lights are finally on again." I knew what she meant. For years, the company had been coasting on legacy while pretending that survival was success. But now, we weren't surviving. We were adapting, and the market noticed. Everlyn remained independent by design. I protected its structure fiercely, even when investors suggested folding it in fully for efficiency. But I knew better. You don't burn down the house that saved you just because the one that once evicted you wants to rebuild. Instead, I set up shared systems only where they made operational sense: joint warehousing in the Midwest, cross-trained supply chain analytics, and parallel testing protocols. Every move was calculated, every decision reviewed with long-term resilience in mind. And behind the scenes, I kept watching, because as much as things had stabilized on paper, I knew that in family businesses, paper was never the whole story. One Friday evening, I received a call from Lana. Her voice was more tense than usual. "Stephen's pushing back again," she said. "He's been meeting privately with 2 legacy board members and trying to reintroduce an alternative roadmap for 2025. He's calling your leadership style over-engineered and risk-averse." I let that sit for a moment, then asked, "Has he brought it to the boardroom?" "Yet not officially," she said, "but he's laying the groundwork. There's a memo being drafted. You're not copied on it." That wasn't surprising. Stephen had always preferred whisper campaigns over real strategy, but the timing caught my attention. We were 2 weeks away from our annual general meeting, where future direction would be discussed openly. If he was preparing to challenge my leadership there, it meant one thing: he still hadn't learned. Instead of confronting it immediately, I documented everything. I had every quarterly report, every client win, every cost reduction mapped clearly. Michael and I built a counter deck before we even saw their memo. I didn't plan to fight. I planned to lead visibly. When the board gathered, I walked in calmly, dressed in the same understated style I'd kept since returning. No designer labels, no power colors, just quiet authority, as expected. Stephen presented a new vision filled with market buzzwords, overambitious projections, and vendor promises that weren't grounded in operational reality. When he finished, a few board members clapped politely. Then they turned to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dismiss his ideas. I simply walked them through what we had done since the transition: the recovered contracts, the restored R&D pipeline, the improved supplier relationships, the new long-term deals signed through Everlyn that now accounted for 27% of our margin. I spoke in facts, clear, simple, undeniable, when I finished. The room was silent. My father was seated at the end, not speaking, not gesturing, just watching. The vote wasn't even close. The board reaffirmed the current direction and requested a formal pause on all new roadmap proposals until Q2 the following year. Stephen didn't speak as he left the room, but for the first time, I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt a kind of settled understanding. He hadn't failed because he was incapable. He had failed because he believed legacy entitled him to leadership, and leadership, I had learned, was never something you inherited. It was something you earned every day. Later that week, I found a letter slid under my door. It was handwritten, signed only with my father's initials. The board asked me to step down next quarter. I've agreed. I won't be in the way anymore. I just wanted you to know I see it now. What you built, what you protected, and what I nearly destroyed. Thank you for not returning the favor. I folded the letter slowly, quietly. No tears, no satisfaction, just closure, because that's what growth looks like when it's real. It doesn't come with fanfare. It comes with stillness. At Everlyn, our next move was expansion into the Canadian market. We had a new distribution agreement signed with a chain that had never been able to crack Zeta Foods' vendor barriers. I flew to Toronto to walk the first production floor with the client team, and while standing there, surrounded by pallets of our product, one of their execs said to me, "It's rare to see someone build something with so much control and still remain invisible in the press." "How did you do it?" I smiled. "You can build loud, or you can build long-term." I chose long-term. They nodded, not needing anything more. The results were in the delivery. And now, everyone knew where it came from. I had gone from being pushed out of my own family's business to holding the power to rebuild it. But I never sought revenge. I sought clarity, and in doing so, I had given others like me, those who were undervalued, underestimated, and quietly erased, a map forward. You don't have to burn it all down to win. Sometimes you just have to keep building until they can't ignore what you've made. There's a moment in every comeback story that doesn't feel like a victory or a breakthrough. It feels like silence, a pause between what collapsed and what you've rebuilt. When the noise finally fades and all you're left with is proof. That was where I stood one morning, alone in the Everlyn command room, staring at a dashboard that showed steady product velocity across 3 regions, 2 new client activations scheduled for next week, and an automated inventory system that had just saved us 12% in supply loss. I didn't smile. I didn't post about it. I just noted the numbers, closed the laptop, and looked out at the line of forklifts moving in quiet rhythm. Everything worked, not because of luck, because of design. Meanwhile, Zeta Foods was evolving slowly, but noticeably. I had stepped into a new hybrid role, executive chair of strategy, overseeing both companies without absorbing them into one another. It gave us the agility of a startup with the infrastructure of a legacy system for the first time. Cross-team meetings didn't feel like battles. Ideas flowed. The R&D team started calling Everlyn's lab to co-develop samples. Clients who had once left quietly were now asking to return. And perhaps the most telling sign of change was this. My name began appearing in the internal newsletters, not as a vendor or a contributor, but as leadership. No fanfare, just fact. But in business, forward movement always invites friction, especially when old power hasn't fully accepted its new limitations. Stephen, despite losing significant influence, hadn't resigned. He remained in a reduced role, nominally overseeing legacy products. Publicly, he played the part. Internally, he remained resistant. During a Q1 planning session, I presented a proposal for shifting 10% of Zeta Foods manufacturing toward a modular fulfillment model, using micro-facilities based on Everlyn's successful remote pilot in Alberta. The model had already cut lead time by 23%. Most of the board supported it. Stephen didn't. He waited until the meeting ended and emailed a group of directors suggesting the idea was unscalable in the current economic climate, and that our focus should remain on traditional strengths. The message was forwarded to me twice in the same hour. I didn't respond directly. I scheduled a meeting. That Thursday, I invited Stephen to the Everlyn floor, just the 2 of us, no audience, no titles. I walked him through the modular facility dashboard, showed him how local fulfillment had lowered freight cost, how our ingredient shelf life had improved because of batch proximity, and how clients were placing reorders faster when they knew regional supply existed. When I finished, I said simply, "This is what forward looks like. You don't have to agree with me, but if you keep working against the system that's keeping the business alive, you're going to be the reason it fails." He didn't reply. He just nodded and left. It wasn't approval. It wasn't defeat. But it was the first time he didn't push back. Later that month, Zeta Foods signed a multi-year co-manufacturing deal with a national vegan brand a client Everlyn had nurtured for 2 years. The terms were clean, the volume high, and the projected revenue increase was the biggest the company had seen since before the pandemic. The CEO of that brand wrote me a note that read, "You weren't just a supplier. You were the difference. It wasn't framed. It wasn't posted on social media." I tucked it in a drawer. Next to the letter my father had written months earlier, I didn't need the words. I had the outcome. And yet, with growth comes tension. Everlyn's success began to attract interest from venture firms. Acquisition offers arrived almost weekly, each with larger numbers, bigger networks, bolder promises. Michael and I reviewed them all. Some were tempting, some were laughable, but all of them had one flaw: they wanted control. And control was never what this was about. This wasn't just a company. It was a blueprint for what happens when you build quietly, hold your ground, and let your work do the speaking. Selling too early, or to the wrong people, would erase the very thing that made it work. So we declined, every single one, politely, firmly, and with no regrets. In the background, my father's health began to decline, not dramatically, but noticeably. He came into the office less often, spoke less during calls. Eventually, he asked to shift into an advisory role, citing the need for distance and reflection. I respected the decision. I didn't pry, but one evening he asked to meet, just him and me. We sat in the corner booth of the same cafe where Noel Ferris had handed me the company's breakdown folder nearly a year before. My father looked tired, not defeated, just weathered. "When you were 15, he said, you asked me why I didn't let Mom go back to teaching. I told you it was better for the family if she stayed focused on us. That wasn't true. I was afraid she'd outgrow me, just like I was afraid you would. I didn't speak. I let the silence fill the space between us." Then he said, "And then you did. And instead of being proud, I panicked. I thought if you proved me wrong, I'd lose my place. Turns out, the only place I ever really had was because you kept it alive." He looked down, then back at me. "I'm sorry." I didn't cry. I didn't say thank you. I said, "I know," and that was enough. The next week, I stood in front of a room filled with team leads from both companies and presented the 5-year vision: dual brand resilience, flexible production, and market-first innovation led by people, not titles. The room didn't erupt. They listened, took notes, asked smart questions. When I finished, Grace, our new COO, and a former Everlyn team lead said, "We're ready." I believed her, because now we weren't just recovering, we were leading. The first time I truly felt the weight of what we had built wasn't in a boardroom or behind a podium. It was at a quiet industry summit in Chicago, where I was scheduled to sit on a panel about sustainable operations. Not the keynote, not the spotlight, just a voice in the mix. I arrived early, kept to myself, reviewed the data I planned to reference, and expected nothing more than polite attention. But when the panel moderator introduced me, something shifted. She didn't say CEO. She didn't say daughter of Zeta Foods founder. She said, "The woman whose supply systems have quietly reshaped the way mid-market food brands think about scale." The applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, earned, and afterward. 3 different founders approached me not to pitch, but to thank me, one said. You proved there's another way to lead. Quiet doesn't mean weak. It means focused. I'd spent years being underestimated for not being loud enough, bold enough, political enough. Now, silence was the edge they couldn't compete with. Back at headquarters, Grace and I began restructuring department leadership based on alignment, not legacy. We moved people based on aptitude, not tenure. We promoted from within, including a production line worker who had been with Zeta Foods for 16 years but had never been offered a management track. When we announced his promotion to operations coordinator, he cried, quietly, pulled me aside and said, "You saw something they never asked about." That stayed with me longer than any client contract ever had, because real revenge, if you could even call it that, wasn't about payback. It was about impact, not just changing the room, but who gets to sit in it. Stephen finally resigned without public explanation, internally. The message was short and professional. Thank you for your years of service. We wish you well. There were no speeches, no handshakes, just a quiet vacancy that no one rushed to fill. His absence created something rare in family companies: air, space, the kind of atmosphere where new thinking could breathe. And in that air, something remarkable happened. A generation of middle managers who had been silenced, stifled, and sidelined began stepping forward. Ideas surfaced. Feedback became honest. People who had once hidden their instincts for fear of crossing the wrong egos were finally contributing without fear. The culture changed, not because of mandates, but because the shadow that kept people small had finally left the room. One day, during a strategy retreat, a junior analyst raised her hand and asked a question I didn't expect. How did you know when it was time to stop trying to prove yourself and start building for yourself? The room went quiet. I paused, not for effect, but because I needed to answer honestly. I didn't. I said, at first, I was still trying to prove something to my father, to the board, to people who had already made up their minds. But eventually, the work became louder than the need to be heard. And once I realized I didn't need to be in the room to control the room, everything changed. She wrote that down. So did 3 others. And that was when I knew the shift was permanent. We weren't just fixing a broken system. We were raising up people who would never again be taught to stay small. Everland's expansion into Asia began taking shape through a joint venture with a sustainability-focused distributor in Singapore. We sent a small task force to set up operations, mostly women, mostly under 35, all promoted internally when the project launched. The partner company's CEO said, "You don't just export product, you export mindset." That was the compliment I held on to, because that was the true legacy, not the title I'd been denied, not the boardroom I'd been dismissed from, but the mindset that kept moving long after I was gone. Meanwhile, my father's presence faded even further. His office was cleared out. His name slowly disappeared from the vendor accounts and external emails. No formal ceremony, just a quiet sunset. I never pushed for a final conversation, but one came anyway. On my birthday, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a journal, old, leather-bound, dated back to the early days of Zeta Foods. His notes, hand-drawn formulations, margins scrawled in the corners. Tucked inside was a single page written recently. What I built gave us a name. What you built gave it meaning. You didn't walk away. You walked through. That's what leaders do. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some acknowledgments don't require applause, just peace. And maybe that's what this was always about. Not dominance, not vengeance, not proving someone wrong, but peace, the kind that only arrives when you've taken every blow, every silence, every stolen idea, and turned it into something no one else could claim. I had rebuilt the company that once erased me, but more importantly, I had rebuilt myself, quietly, honestly, fully. And the best part, I wasn't the only one. I looked around the organization now and saw faces that had once hidden their ambition finally stepping into their voice. People who had been told they were too soft, too strange, too late were now leading departments, launching divisions, rewriting the same rules that had once held them down. So when people asked me now, "How did you do it?" I always gave the same answer. I stayed. Through the silence, through the dismissal, through the erasure, I stayed. Not in the same room, but in the same truth. I didn't need a title. I didn't need revenge. I needed vision, and when the dust settled, the story wasn't that I had built a business. It was that I never let them convince me I couldn't. It wasn't until the Global Food Systems Expo in Milan that I fully realized what Everlyn had become. We weren't just a vendor or a rising player anymore. We were the quiet benchmark that other companies were now trying to reverse engineer. I arrived late on purpose, not out of arrogance, but to avoid the press crowd gathering around the flashier brands. When I walked past the display floors, I noticed something strange. Our packaging was being used as an example in a presentation about next-gen supply logic. Not our name, but our design, our format, our timelines. That's when it hit me. People had started copying the company I built in silence. I walked into our own booth, where Grace and the Everlyn Asia team were finalizing a showcase for cold chain expansion. One of the Singapore partners turned to me and said, "Everyone here wants to figure out how you did it without a spotlight," I answered simply. I built like no one was watching, because for years, no one was. Later that evening, I was invited to a closed dinner hosted by one of the top accelerators in Europe. Only 12 guests, all female founders, all with different battle scars. As we went around the table, sharing what we'd faced and what we'd learned, one of them, someone I'd followed from afar, turned to me and asked, "Did you ever want to burn it all down?" I paused, considered it honestly, then said, "No, I wanted to outlive it, quietly, entirely, without needing to explain myself to the very people who tried to erase me." The table went silent for a moment. Then she smiled. That's stronger than revenge. And in that room, surrounded by women who had fought their way through glass ceilings and locked doors, I understood something deeper. We weren't here just because we'd survived. We were here because we refused to become like the ones who tried to silence us. When I flew back to California, something unexpected was waiting. A letter, not digital, not couriered handwritten, hand-delivered to the Everlyn office. It was from Elise Rowan, the investor who once told me I was operationally brilliant but not scalable as a leader. Inside her letter, she admitted she had misread what leadership actually looked like. "You were never trying to be the loudest person in the room." She wrote, "You were building the room itself, and now the market's trying to fit inside what you built." She asked if I would consider speaking at a private summit for emerging female CEOs she was mentoring. I didn't respond right away, not because I held a grudge, but because I wanted to be sure the invitation came from realignment, not guilt. After a few days, I sent back a note, "I'll come," but only if we're not just talking about funding. We're talking about structure, survival, silence, and what it actually costs to lead without applause. She agreed. Around that same time, I received word that Zeta Foods had been shortlisted for a National Supplier Excellence Award. the same award they'd been disqualified from 2 years prior due to poor fulfillment. The board asked if I'd be willing to represent the company if we won. My father wouldn't be attending. He had quietly moved to Oregon, living near the coast, fully retired. I said yes, not because I needed the trophy, but because it felt like closing a loop that had been open far too long. When we won, the applause didn't shake the room. It wasn't explosive, but it was honest. I stepped up, accepted the plaque, and gave the shortest speech of the evening. Success isn't just built on what you do right. Sometimes it's built on everything you refuse to do wrong. We kept building, even when no one was watching. After the event, a younger executive from a startup I didn't recognize walked up and said, "I used to think leadership was about owning the room, but after hearing you, I think it's about being able to walk away from it without losing yourself." I nodded. She got it. That was the real shift, not in titles or stock prices, but in how the next generation now saw power: quiet, consistent, values first. That's the kind of legacy no award could measure. Back at Everlyn, things had become smoother, not easier, just more aligned. I no longer attended every daily ops call. I didn't micromanage every proposal. The systems were working, and more importantly, people were rising. Grace had developed 2 lieutenants strong enough to run regional decisions without her. Our Singapore division had launched a mentorship initiative modeled after the one we had piloted internally. One of our warehouse leads had taken a night course in logistics automation and was now shadowing our systems architect. This wasn't just a business. It was an ecosystem of second chances, quiet rebuilders, late bloomers, people like me who'd been told they weren't enough. One evening, standing outside our main facility, I looked across the parking lot and saw one of our interns walking a new hire through the fulfillment flow. She was pointing, explaining, leading with clarity. I didn't interrupt. I didn't wave. I just watched. That's when I realized the story had outgrown me. What I built was no longer mine to carry alone. And that, more than any deal or headline, was the moment I felt most free. The last board meeting I ever led was in a modest conference room. Not some high-rise with sweeping views or marble floors, just glass walls, filtered light, and a round table with 10 people who now understood that silence didn't mean surrender. I opened with 3 numbers: 62% margin increase, 43% in new client retention, and 98% fulfillment precision. No one clapped. They nodded, took notes, processed it like professionals. That's what I wanted. No applause, just recognition rooted in clarity. I didn't announce my next steps that day. I didn't say it was my last meeting. But as I looked around the room, I saw something I hadn't seen before: complete trust. I had done what I came to do, not to reclaim a title or outshine someone who had pushed me out, but to quietly rebuild the very definition of success on my own terms. Later that week, I visited my father. He lived alone now, in a quiet home by the coast, surrounded by old cookbooks and even older memories. His health had stabilized. His routine was simple, and he greeted me not with pride or guilt, but presence. "The company's in good hands," he said. "Better hands." I nodded. "It's not just the company," I replied. "It's the people in it. They finally believe they matter." He didn't answer. He just looked out the window and whispered. I never knew how to build that part. It wasn't regret. It was truth. And that truth mattered more than any apology ever could. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the same spreadsheet I had opened the night I was pushed out. Contingency projects. Only now. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a legacy. The list had grown. not with tactics or fail-safes, but with names, people I had mentored, promoted, partnered with, people who had once been invisible like me and now ran departments, launched brands, taught others how to hold power without holding others down. And that's when it hit me. I had always thought the climax of my story would be the day I proved them wrong. But the real climax was this, the day I no longer needed to. I didn't throw a farewell party. I didn't write a grand exit memo. I quietly informed the board I'd be stepping back from day-to-day strategy and shifting into an external advisory role. I offered to stay on for quarterly transition support. Grace was ready, her team was ready, and more importantly, I was ready, not to escape, but to expand. 2 months later, I sat on a small podcast, one that didn't even crack the top 100 business charts. The host was a former HR manager turned workplace advocate. She asked, "What would you say to the version of yourself who got that transition folder? Without warning, I didn't hesitate. Thank them, I said, because they gave me something clearer than recognition. They gave me freedom. Once you're out of the place where your worth is conditional, you realize you were never meant to beg for space. You were meant to build it." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You didn't just build a company. You built a way forward." That stuck with me, because deep down, that was always the goal. Not revenge, not legacy, but a map for the quiet ones who don't fight with noise, but win with clarity. At the next summit, I was introduced simply as Catherine Zeta-Jones, architect of Everlyn, no mention of Zeta Foods, no family legacy, just the name I had built for myself, not the one I had inherited. In my keynote, I shared only one lesson: if you're waiting for someone to see your value, stop. Build so clearly they have no choice but to adjust their view. That line was quoted in 3 newsletters, but I didn't care about that. What mattered was the line of young women waiting afterward, not for autographs, but to ask real questions. How do you lead when you've been silenced? How do you keep going when every room feels built to shut you out? How do you build something that lasts without burning everything down? I didn't give them flashy answers. I told them the truth. You do it one hard choice at a time. You do it without shortcuts. And you do it even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. Years later, I received an email from someone I didn't recognize. It was a junior analyst from my first year at Everlyn. Long before the merger, she had left to pursue an MBA, then started her own operations firm. Her subject line read, "You taught me how to stand still and not disappear. In the body," she wrote, "the world teaches us to move fast, talk loud, chase titles. You showed me the opposite. You stood still, held your ground, and the world moved around you. I needed you to know that changed me." I sat with that email longer than I've sat with some client contracts, because that was the real return on investment. Not dollars, not praise, but change that echoes beyond the room. So when people ask now, was it worth it? All the silence, all the erasure, all the years of not being seen, I answer honestly, yes, because I didn't stay to be seen. I stayed to see it through. And now, standing here, not with a crown, not on a stage, but in full clarity, I know this. I built something they can't take. I built something they now depend on. And most importantly, I built something that taught others how to begin again,